So nuclear power plants themselves are the least flexible type of generation. They have capacity factors close to 100%, which means that the typical mode of operation is to turn them on, ramp them up to their maximum capacity, and then leave them on for as long as possible. In theory, nuclear power plants are capable of ramping up or down, but this is not pursued in the United States. Other countries across the world do practice this, notably France, which derives more than 70% of its electricity generation using nuclear power plants. So in the United States, the typical function of nuclear power plants is shown here, is to provide this very, very steady, consistent baseload source of generation. On top of that is then layered coal, and then more flexible peaking resources like natural gas and hydropower. So let's talk about nuclear power plant economics. So there are highly diverging views on this topic, and that is not helped by the fact that these are extremely expensive investments. And so the decision about whether or not a nuclear power plant is economical and worth pursuing is really a multi-billion-dollar decision. So there's a funny quote that I read that says the only two numbers which matter in nuclear power are the capital cost and the cost of capital. So in other words, the amount that it costs to build the nuclear power plant, and then the interest rate on the debt that's acquired when borrowing the money to build the power plant. So nuclear power plants have enormous upfront capital costs, and these capital costs are then turned into, as we've discussed many times, fixed costs associated with the mortgage payments on that debt that have to be paid back over the lifetime of the power plant. So this figure gives you a sense for what the overnight capital costs are. These are listed in dollars per kilowatt. So if we think about the typical nuclear power plant being on the order of 2,000 megawatts, where 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts, we're looking at capital costs of on the order of $8 billion. So the Vogtle and VC Summer plants are two plants that are relevant to the United States. So we think about the levelized cost of electricity, and we've seen this figure before. Remember, the levelized cost of electricity is sort of the lifetime cost. So it's the fixed cost plus the variable cost, all rolled into one number, so $1 per megawatt hour number. And that dollar per megawatt hour number is the price of electricity that the power plant would have to sell its electricity for in order to recoup its cost over its lifetime. So it's sort of like the break-even price of electricity. And we've looked at, you can see here on this figure, I've circled nuclear. And so the life cycle cost, the levelized cost of electricity from nuclear power plants, is a little bit north of $100 per megawatt hour, which is expensive compared to natural gas and in many cases solar, hydro, and wind. Now, 80% of this cost, this levelized cost of electricity from nuclear power plants, originates from capital costs. So the one thing I think you have to realize about nuclear power is that in some cases the cost of electricity is increasing as a result of increased capital cost, potentially because of increased regulations. This is occurring at the same time that we're seeing really unprecedented decreases in the cost of wind energy, solar energy, and also electricity from natural gas. We talked last time about how natural gas prices have been extremely low for close to a decade. A big part of that is increased production from unconventional natural gas deposits via horizontal hydraulic fracturing. So at this point, the lifetime cost of electricity from nuclear power plants is much higher than that of wind, solar, and natural gas. So a big part of that is the enormous upfront capital cost associated with nuclear power plants. However, nuclear power plants, once they're built, actually have low operational costs, and this is because of higher energy density and economies of scale. And so typically, if you had a nuclear power plant that was built, from an operational standpoint, its placement in the system supply curve in the merit order is pretty low. So it would be above hydropower and variable renewable energy like wind and solar, but probably below coal, natural gas, and oil. And so what that means is that because of their low variable costs, nuclear power plants are often competitive in wholesale electricity markets. Once you build a nuclear power plant, in other words, it's often able to sell its electricity into the market. And so we can sort of think about that from a microeconomic standpoint, as nuclear power plants tend to be on the left-hand side of the demand curve, suggesting that it's selected by the market based on a cost basis to provide electricity. Remember, power plants that are on the other side, to the right of the demand curve in the supply curve, in a case like this, would not be selected by the market to run. If you're a nuclear power plant operating in a competitive wholesale market for electricity, that I guess guarantees you or gives you a reasonable expectation that you'll be able to sell the electricity that you produce. However, you have fixed costs that are extremely high, remember. And what about revenues? So just because you're able to sell electricity from your power plant doesn't mean that your revenues are going to be really high. If you're a nuclear power plant in a competitive market for electricity, you also have to worry about what the price of electricity is going to be. And so in recent years, deregulated markets across the U.S. have been experiencing a slowdown in electricity demand growth for a variety of reasons. Also, natural gas prices, as we talked about last time, which are depressing electricity prices in deregulated markets. If you add on to that rapid growth in renewable energy, which can also push wholesale market prices down, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this class, all that adds up to lower prices for nuclear power plants. So remember, the effect of low natural gas prices is to reduce the variable cost associated with producing electricity from natural gas power plants. So that's why their variable cost here is shown as something that can vary over a range. It can be either really cheap or really expensive. It so happens that today, because of really low natural gas prices, largely due to increased supply from horizontal hydraulic fracturing, the variable cost of producing electricity from natural gas plants is a lot lower. And so when we think about the impact of that on the system supply curve in a competitive market for wholesale electricity, what that means is that the portion of the system supply curve that's associated with natural gas plants gets a lot smaller. And so that's what's shown here in green. And what that means is that even for the same amount of electricity demand, the market price of electricity is going to be a lot lower. So the intersection of supply and demand when natural gas prices are low occurs at a lower point on the y-axis, and so we have a lower price for electricity in competitive markets when gas prices are lower. And so what that means for nuclear power plants is that not only are the fixed costs high, but the revenues are going to be small, because even though they have low variable costs and they're able to sell their electricity in competitive wholesale markets, prices in wholesale electricity markets are now so low that nuclear power plants' revenues are diminished as well. And so the result is that very few nuclear power plants are being planned in the United States, and many existing plants are actually being retired, especially in deregulated electricity markets. So part of this is that the nuclear power plants that we have now tend to be quite old. Most are between 30 and 50 years old. And so we can sort of visually see when nuclear power plants were added in the United States. They're the light red color here. So we saw an increased rate of construction of nuclear power plants through the 70s, a lot of new construction in the mid-80s and late 1980s. And so a lot of those power plants are the ones that are still operating today, and they're really old. So many of these power plants need additional capital investment, so physical improvements to make them adhere to new regulations or to ensure that they're reliable. And so that those improvements mean that the power plant owners would need to borrow a lot more money, and so this means signing up for new mortgage payments out into the future. However, if you're a nuclear power plant and you're facing this decision of needing to borrow a lot more money in order to invest in improvements on site to make sure that the plant is reliable and operational out into the future. And you're looking at the money that's coming into your operation by selling electricity, you are probably looking at high costs on one hand and low revenues on the other hand. And so today, about 50% of all nuclear power plants in the U.S. sell in deregulated markets. And because of low market prices in competitive markets for electricity, again, due to the lower demand, low natural gas prices, and increasing market share of renewables, these plants cannot ensure a market price for electricity that will actually help them cover the cost of service. So essentially, these plants, even the ones that we have that are online now, are too expensive to keep open in the face of rising maintenance costs and low electricity prices. And so we have started to see nuclear power plants all over the country being retired. And this is a similar situation in some cases to what we've seen with coal. I mean, I think the response from nuclear has been not as rapid or stark as with coal. And I think the main difference is there is that coal was really hit by a number of targeted regulations, additions to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Power Plan, rules about the emissions of mercury and other air toxics. And so a lot of this really rapidly precipitated this rapid retirement of coal-fired power plants in the U.S. But we also talked about how one of the things that was driving coal-fired power plants out of the market was being directly outcompeted with natural gas, and in some cases renewables, but also low market prices for electricity. And so this is very similar. Nuclear power plants are facing less of a direct regulatory threat compared to coal, but the same market forces that have forced coal out, which are predominantly low demand and really low natural gas prices, increasing market share from renewables, are exactly the same forces that are responsible for forcing nuclear power plants offline and keeping, in many cases, new nuclear power plants from being built. So what about in regulated markets? So that sort of describes the situation in competitive markets. Now, one of the things that's really important about the economics of nuclear power, and this is not something that would necessarily impact the cost, but whether the decision about whether a nuclear power plant would be built is who bears the risks from future uncertainty. So in competitive markets for electricity, or in states that are deregulated, if a utility decides to build a new nuclear power plant and that turns out to be a bad decision, that company that builds the generation plant is itself the one that would bear the risk, the financial risk associated with, for example, building a nuclear power plant that is too expensive and can't sell its electricity at a high enough price to cover its costs. That was the whole point of market deregulation, was this response to states, regulatory commissions in conjunction with utilities approving these costly projects that weren't actually needed. Now, in regulated states like in North Carolina, we still have this model where ultimately the bearers of the risk of decisions about new capacity are ratepayers, customers. And so as a result, until a few years ago, only a few states with regulated electricity markets, shown here, so Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, those are the only states in the United States that were planning to build new nuclear power plants. And so the regulatory model, the monopoly, the regulated monopoly, has been essential to incentivizing utilities to build nuclear power plants. And that's because if nuclear power plants end up costing too much and demand is lower than expected, utilities, the builders and the owners of these nuclear power plants, would have a legal pathway to make their money back by increasing prices for customers. And so this is what we saw again in the 1970s happen. So utilities are very, very upfront about this, right? So this is a quote from Tom Fanning, the CEO of Southern Company, a couple of years ago. And he says, "We have the kind of regulatory environment." Now, Southern Company, just for reference, is based in the southeastern United States. It's active in those states that were colored orange in that previous map. And he says, "We have the kind of regulatory environment that supports this kind of long-term, high capital cost big bet. In deregulated markets, you don't have any pricing that will support this kind of investment, and that's a shame." So what he's lamenting here is the fact that competitive wholesale markets for electricity are subject to market forces. If demand goes down, if supply increases, or if supply becomes cheaper because of low natural gas prices, or decreasing cost of renewables, then what that means is it's a source of uncertainty for a nuclear power plant, and the nuclear power plants are not capable of dealing with those sorts of market forces and still coming out as economically viable investments. However, even in states that are regulated, most of the planned nuclear power plants have been canceled, and a big issue there is longevity. Compared to wind, solar, and natural gas, nuclear power plants have very long project lives, about 40 to 60 years. That used to be kind of viewed as a plus, and now not so much, because they need a long, long time to recoup the initial capital costs. And the reality is that the grid is changing really quickly. Adding more wind and solar may just be the beginning. We'll talk about other aspects of future grids that are more reliant on renewable energy, that may, for all intents and purposes, exclude baseload technologies that are not flexible, like nuclear. And so an open question is whether we're going to need nuclear power plants to provide, or anything to provide, stable baseload generation out, decades into the future. And that it may seem like an irrelevant question, but because of the long lifetime of nuclear power plants, it's important. We have to think about what the role of nuclear power plants would be 40 years from now, especially considering the fact that sometimes these plants are designed to operate at least that long, and sometimes even longer. So the bizarre aspect of nuclear power and its recent struggles to hold on and expand in the United States is the fact that it's a safe, proven, and somewhat affordable low to zero carbon technology. So we started out this class talking about the goal of needing to reduce carbon emissions in the electric power sector. And so it may, on the face of it, seem insane that we're not relying on nuclear power. There are a lot of people that feel that this is insane, to de-emphasize nuclear power and its role in providing low carbon electricity. There's a reasonable chance that if we fail to combat climate change, we may look back and think that one of the major issues was this reluctance to embrace nuclear power as a technology, especially given the fact that we've already been relying on it for so long. The irony is that despite its advantages as a safe, proven, and somewhat affordable low carbon technology, its really high upfront costs and its dependence on stability, market stability over such a long time period, has really made the construction of nuclear power plants less attractive in the United States. And this could have pretty significant ramifications in terms of our desire to reduce carbon emissions. So this is from a projection of what CO2 emissions from the electric power sector could look like if in a reference case where nuclear power plants that are already in existence last until their scheduled retirement, where they would be paying off all their mortgage. And that is compared here with a situation in which nuclear power plants are retired much faster. For example, because financially they're underwater, they're not able to recoup their cost of service through selling electricity into competitive wholesale markets. And the difference in terms of CO2 emissions is non-trivial. So we would see a significant increase in CO2 emissions if we rapidly retired nuclear power plants or allowed them to retire. So next time we're going to talk about the last conventional generation technology, hydropower. So reading number 8 is up on Moodle, so please read that for next time.